of the Lord unto Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. Mountains would become plains before Zerubbabel. His hands laid the foundation, and with his very hands the temple would be completed with shoutings of grace, grace. The Lord would abundantly supply the work under Zerubbabel. Now also by the word of Zechariah, silver and gold were taken and made into crowns that were placed on the head of Joshua the high priest. And again Zechariah prophesied about the branch building the temple, bearing the glory and sitting and ruling upon his throne and being a priest. Although Zechariah reminded the people of what the Lord did to them when they sinned, the primary message was a very great and good news. In chapter 8, the word was that the Lord was jealous for Zion, and that he had returned. Old men and women and boys and girls would fill the streets in safety. He told of a coming time when people from all over the world would be gathered to Jerusalem and live in prosperity and peace, because the Lord had thought to do well to Jerusalem and to Judah. 10 men from nations all over the world would grab the skirt of just one Jew and say, We will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Not only did Zechariah tell the people about the good that God was going to do to them, but he also spoke of the punishment that God would render to their enemies. Jerusalem and Judah would be recompensed for the evil done unto them, and God would use them as his sword and his bow and his arrow against his enemies. And God's own people will be the precious stones in his crown and the banner that waves over his land. Zechariah revealed to the people that the Lord had punished their shepherds because they did not care for the sheep. So the Lord visited his flock, and he made them his goodly war horse in the battle. He strengthened them, enabled them to fight, and sent them forth out of the pit. He had mercy on them and caused them to rejoice. He promised to gather them from the nations where they had been scattered and bring them to place them in their own land. Their state will be such that it will be as though he had never even cast them off. What wonderful things Zechariah fed to these people. How these words must have cheered them, encouraged them, made them stronger in the work that they were engaged in. And indeed, they did finish building the temple under Zechariah's prophetic messages. The Lord did as he said he would do through the mouth of Zechariah. The people who were scattered and returning from captivity and who were basically starting all over again had now rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem for God to dwell in. According to Ezra's record, in a period of about 4 years, they completed this. Without Zechariah and Haggai, this work could not and would not have been completed, if it would have even been started without them. Zechariah had awakened the people and got them back to work. He identified for them why God had punished them. He identified the main problems for them, which were their shepherds. He gave them good news of the Lord's desire to return with mercies, to cause them to increase and abound, to punish their enemies, and to secure a glorious future for this people. Now, having considered all this, I can't help but think it was somewhat of an embarrassment for Zechariah to have to ask this question. If you think I've done you any good, then pay me my wages. And if not, forbear, forget it. If you don't think it's worth it. I want to read this from some other versions. Contemporary English version says, I told them, pay me my wages if you think you should, otherwise forget it. Douay-Rheims Bible says, and I said to them, if it be good in your eyes, bring hither my wages, and if not, be quiet. Good News Bible said, I said to them, if you are willing, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And God's word, then I said to them, if it's all right with you, pay me my wages, but if it's not, don't. That had to be somewhat embarrassing. The prophet doesn't ask for any certain amount here. He leaves us up to the people here. He sets neither minimum nor maximum. Pay me if you want to, and pay me only what you think I've earned. And if you don't think I've earned anything, then don't pay anything. Just the fact that he had to bring the subject up already reveals how they valued his service. But then again, ultimately, this wasn't Zechariah's message, and it wasn't really Zechariah who was asking, how much is this worth to you? Ultimately, God is asking, if you are willing, give me my wages. It's true, you can't put a dollar sign on a message from God. You can't buy heavenly merchandise with earthly money, but neither should the prophet of God be allowed to go hungry and without earthly needs. We have seen people spend great sums of money, even more than what it's worth, for earthly things that perish. How much should God's people spend for things that do not perish? Paul speaks of the relation to receiving spiritual things to spending carnal things on two different occasions. The first in his epistle to the Roman brethren, chapter 15, verses 26 and 27. For it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. It hath pleased them, verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things. So you see, spiritual things and carnal things are not completely unrelated in this respect. And he wrote similar to the Corinthians, who, like the Jews in Zechariah's day, were ignorant of this principle. Paul reminded them that while he worked among them, they did not pay him. He had to remind them. He had to point it out to them. I don't think they even would have noticed if he didn't tell them. I want to read this from the God's Word version. If we have planted the spiritual seed that has been of benefit to you, is it too much if we receive part of the harvest from your earthly goods? Is that asking too much? So Zechariah asks, if ye think good. So they thought about it. They decided on a monetary value for his ministry, and they weighed it. Without any pressure from Zechariah, they decided on the worth of his service, and they put the money on a scale to be exact in their payment. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. Now, you'll notice they didn't want to look bad by forbearing. They did want to pay something, yet they made themselves even look worse by paying so little. It isn't that the silver had no value or that Zechariah had no use for the silver. I would imagine actually this was a pretty good amount of money to have all at one time. If you spread it out over 4 years, it's only 7.5 pieces of silver per year. But when you have 30 pieces of silver all at once, it's probably not a bad sum. But when we consider that Zechariah delivered the very words of God to them, and the word was mostly a very good word, when we consider that Zechariah's good word was a very great help and encouragement for the people in completing the temple, when we consider that the temple was the exclusive dwelling place of the Lord, and when we consider where the people might have been and what their end might have been if it were not for Zechariah's prophesying, then 30 pieces of silver begins to look smaller and smaller. Now, we don't have to guess about what the Lord thought of it. The next verse, and the Lord said unto me, cast it unto the potter, a goodly price that I was priced out of them. Don't even spend it, Zechariah. Don't even keep it. It's an insult. Cast it. Don't even hand it to the potter. Cast it to the potter. They weren't really pricing Zechariah's service. They were actually pricing God. This is the Lord speaking when he says, a goodly price that I was priced at. This is the Lord said that. Zechariah didn't say that. I was priced at by them. This is, of course, the greatest of sarcasm, for this was not a good price. The Good News Bible says the magnificent sum they thought I was worth. 30 pieces of silver. The entire project from start to finish had been initiated and supplied by God. You recall he stirred up Cyrus to begin rebuilding the temple and to provide for it. He stirred up the people to do the work. He stirred up the prophets and gave them the words to say. He caused the work to begin again by King Darius' decree. The Lord moved kings and nations and caused supplies and provisions to be brought in from all over the world for these people to build his temple.